Welcome, everybody, to the Indie Game Lunch Hour. Today is a very special episode. We are speaking with Amir Satvat, legendary influencer in the games industry and the director of business development at Tencent Games, and we'll be talking about how you can achieve your game dev dreams.
The Indie Game Lunch Hour.
Amazing. Welcome, everybody. In our live magical podcast, we give game developers the chance to hear stories of breaking in from industry experts, as well as directly ask them questions about their areas of expertise in the second half of each episode. This is a mostly unedited recording of a weekly event we host in our Discord, where, we talk with game developers about how they got started in games. Happens every Wednesday at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, so feel free to swing by and join us for the next one. There are links down below. I'm your host, as always, Willem Delventhal, the headmaster of the Indie Game Academy and the Purple Wizard of Games. And joining me today is Amir Satvat. Amir is, yes, a legendary LinkedIn and games influencer, as well as the director of business at Tencent Games. Amir, welcome to the show. What are you having for lunch today?
It's funny. I went to, being from New England, there's a sandwich shop here called D'Angelo. And it's the type of place that you really only go to if you're on a road trip or you're going to the airport. And I hadn't gone there in a long time because I associate it with like being a kid. So I was like, I'll get a sandwich from there. So I got a chicken teriyaki sandwich from D'Angelo, and it was very, very good.
Amazing. Did it throw you back? Did you get the major nostalgia vibes right away?
I definitely did. I definitely did. I actually think in our lifetime, I think the thing that has changed the most after technology is food. It's kind of amazing to note the few things that have kind of really made it through that aren't like mega franchises, you know? I feel like everything's so different now.
Amazing. Yeah. Ulysses, let me know if my mic is working now. We are streaming this as well. That's lovely to hear. The power of nostalgia is incredibly powerful. That effect we have, the memory we have of those things from the past that come back to haunt us. I recently got to visit Booth Bay Harbor, which is one of my favorite places in the world. That's up in Maine. I haven't been there since I was a kid. And what struck me, Amir, was how small it was. Because when I was a kid, it was this massive wonderland, and I walked across the whole town in 5 minutes. What happened?
It's really true. I feel like it's awfully fun, isn't it, going back to places and cycles that we associate with. I definitely felt that this year. I really miss seeing everybody at GDC, but in part it was for really good cause because our family went to Disney World. And to your point, we've gone to Disney World now. I think this was like the sixth or seventh time, starting when I was 3 or 4. And so it's like you think about the entire cycles, like generations going with my grandparents, how everything's like e-ticketed now. It's definitely very different. And to your point, while very, very vast, definitely seems smaller each time I go back.
I love that. Well, our first
Yeah.
question generally on this show is for the origin story. It's the all important question. People who are just getting started in games are always curious about it. So, Amir, I would love to hear your origin story, and I'm really excited for this. How did you get started in games, and how did you get to where you are now?
I really appreciate it. So, so I fell in love with games very, very young. When I was 3 years old, my family got an Atari 2600, and I remember sitting around that with my grandparents and falling in love with it, and basically didn't stop. I mean, dating myself, given I'm in my 40s, like I started with Atari and very early PC games and continued on with obviously Nintendo and point and click adventures, and a lot of those early loves stayed with me. But in terms of professionally, I had built up general skills in finance strategy, business development things, which has in fact ended up being where I've spent my entire career of, almost 2 decades. But when I came out of the market, I wanted to find roles in games, living in Connecticut as I did, as everybody here knows, right? Particularly imagine in like 2004 when I was coming out of school, there were basically no games jobs on the East Coast. Epic wasn't really a thing. Like Bethesda existed, but I obviously didn't live in Maryland. And so I applied out to jobs starting in college 20 years ago. But every single role was like move to California, move to Seattle, move to some other place on the West Coast. And everybody has to make these key turning point decisions in their life of like, how flexible am I willing to be and what's the most important thing? And I decided then that, which I've continued to decide, that the most important thing in my life, which is not the decision for everybody, but it was the one for me, was being near my family and closest friends and remaining in New England. And so because of that, despite really wanting to work in the industry and even having, interviews and potentially good prospects for offers, that wasn't going to happen then. And so, as I tell so many people who get frustrated and are like, Amir, like, I'm just coming out of school, what do I do? This basically fast forwarded 15 years to going to graduate school, working in investment banking, working in corporate jobs. I worked at Goldman Sachs. Then I did a triple master's. And then after that was over, the story is more explainable. I basically was at some variety of tech and health tech places doing a variety of like business development strategy type roles. And then finally at 36, I ended up at Amazon, where I was the COO for our inside sales and demand gen business at AWS. And I often tell people that if you're kind of stuck, the best way to make a lateral work out is to be at a big company that also has a games division. So based upon the performance at AWS, before COVID stuff and everything, I got a strong recommendation from my bosses for Amazon's Prime Gaming Group, and they were willing to give me a shot remote. And so I started at Prime Gaming as a BD lead for that business, managing 4 business development people, and that was great. After that, I was the principal producer for our Amazon Game Studio in Montreal. And then after that, when there was a bit of a reorg there, I went back over to AWS for a little while. And then I finally ended up at my current role at Tencent Games. And August will be a year. I'm really grateful that Tencent actually put up an office in Connecticut to accommodate my family so that we could be here and not have to worry about paperwork and taxes and so forth. And they've been a great employer, have really supported all the social media stuff. So it was a long time coming and took a lot of patience, but I never gave up on that dream for a minute the whole way, hoping that at some point something would change that would give me a chance. And I just kept learning about the industry, playing games, playing over 2,000 games, staying sharp, reading industry periodicals, building up my skills. So when that moment came, I would be ready.
Wow, what a cool origin story. There's a lot to pull out of that, and that's one of the main reasons I love this question at the beginning of every episode. Also, I have a new success metric. When somebody makes an office for me outside my home, that's how I know I've made it. I also love that, I love the concept of this lateral move at a large company, making it more realistic to get into games. We've done enough of these episodes now that I can definitely repeat that info and confidently say that tends to be true. That tends to be what we hear from a lot of people. And that the transitioning into a games role is still one of the most common ways that you're going to land that first job. I also love that you're continuously learning. You want to jump in on that one?
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I totally agree with you. Like, I mean, everybody I've met over those 20 years in games, everybody hits that log jam. Like, it's obviously been more of a point of attention the past 2 years because things have been so difficult for so many people. But to your point, everybody hits that log jam if you ask them. And you just have to get creative and find a way to break it. But keep going, Willen. Yeah.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, that's exactly what happened to me as well. I had help. I had some privilege here because my older brother was already working in the industry. I got a nice little sprinkling of nepotism. But the reality is I started as an engineer long before I was ever a designer. And that transition is what actually allowed me to get there. And I started at Lumosity, which is like kind of a games company. It is a games company, but it is largely a tech company that kind of has games. And so much like you, my experience was learning how to make other processes work before, I was allowed to work on games. I think something to call out of that I'm curious if you agree on. One of the perspectives I try to give members of the Indie Game Academy, especially those who are starting to feel the pressure of a definitely difficult time in games hiring, is every step is still a step. Meaning, when you get a role that is outside of games, even if that role really, truly, even if that role is like waiting tables or something like that, that really feels completely disconnected from games, every one of those steps, as long as you keep learning and as long as you keep growing and networking and attempting to get your in the game industry, every one of those steps is a step forward. You're starting to prove that you're hireable. You're starting to get general working rules and experience. And then definitely once you work your way into tech or really heavily applicable roles, you're getting closer still. So you're not getting rejected per se by not getting the job in games right away. You're just a couple steps away from it.
Yeah, no, you're definitely right. I mean, look, I'm going to have probably, if there's some scale, I imagine I'm going to have amongst, if not the most egalitarian attitude around this, around people you interview, in the sense that, I come from a family where some people have gone to really elite colleges. Some of them haven't gone to college at all. Some of them have gone to community college. Some have gone to state schools. Some people in my family have made their own startup businesses and own like franchises. Some of them work wage jobs. Some of them are like the high finance, white collar professionals. So what I'm trying to say is like, I've seen people make lots of crazy shit happen from lots of different angles. I've had friends who worked at GameStop or worked at Micro Center or worked at Best Buy and ended up having professional jobs in the games industry later. And so like I really don't appreciate, if I can be a little bit blunt, that like people have these views of like, this is what a gamer looks like. This is what a real gamer looks like. Like I find that really kind of gross, to be honest with you. I always tell people that nobody ever has the right to take away your identity as being a gamer. Whether you happen to receive money doing that professionally is just like the cherry on top. But no matter what you do, the way you conduct yourself, the way you learn, the way you stay sharp about the industry, to me, that's what makes you a gamer. Or not. Like, even for some people, being a gamer, like my mom plays like word games on her cell phone. Does my mom not have the right to consider herself a gamer? She's a gamer. So, I think just need to break down these attitudes of even what a gamer is, let alone what a pathway is to a games job, because there is no standard pathway.
Ooh. I thought I'd be getting some hot audio clips from this episode, but that was a gem right there. 110,000% agree. I am an advocate for breaking down gatekeeping. Anytime you find a gate, kick it open and then hold it open for the people behind you. I have a sort of roundabout addition to this thought that I'm going to bring it back. It's going to make sense in a second. I am a fairly spiritual person. There's a guy that I worked with at one point who is a Peruvian man who basically leads like ceremonies. Not too important who exactly he is. But during one of his ceremonies, he gave this quote that I thought was beautiful, which was, "The minute you add anything after I am, you are diminishing yourself. The minute you add anything after I am, you are diminishing yourself." His point, I think, is exactly what you're saying, Amir, which is that I am. It doesn't take any more than me saying those two words for me to exist and for me to be worthy of existing in any capacity that I see fit. In fact, if I add a little bit more, in the first chapter of Jesse Schell's book, The Art of Game Design, he talks about how you become a game developer. And he has a very, very complicated process that most of you probably can't keep up with, which is say out loud, "I am a game developer. Congratulations, you did it." There's no rhyme or reason to who you are or what it takes to become. As long as you claim you are, that's really my point. As long as you say I'm a gamer, as long as you feel like a gamer, you're a part of this community. We want you a part of this community. That also applies to being a game developer. You don't have to be a professional game developer making hundreds of thousands of dollars to be a game developer.
Oh, and I'm revealing my age a little bit too. And again, my perspective will certainly not be everybody's perspective. But as a person in his 40s with like 3 kids and now living back home near my parents, like I have a great degree of pragmatism about what it means to work in a games job. Like, do I enjoy working in a games job industry? Of course I do. But I would, if tomorrow I lost this job, I had to put food on the table for my family, we needed to move somewhere else or do something different, and it was outside games, I would do that in a second. Like, to me, it's like it matters. But I personally believe that you should never set yourself up that any aspect of your professional identity or what you do is, to your point, what personally defines you, or attaining or not attaining some aspect of that professional attainment either means that you've succeeded or you failed. It reminds me of Bill. I always forget if it was Bill Russell or Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. I think it was Bill Russell, who, when he got the Medal of Freedom, he said, people often say that to your point, I'm a basketball player. And he always said, no, I'm a man who plays basketball. And that always stuck with me.
I love that. I love that. Yeah. So claim your identity. Everybody in this room, everybody's here, I believe, to talk about how you can achieve your games dreams. But perhaps the first part of your games dreams should be something like enjoying the journey, because it's going to take some time, and the journey is going to come in unexpected ways. I didn't realize that dressing like a purple wizard at GDC would become as iconic as it has become. Now I am the purple wizard. It's great. I'd love to talk about that topic, though. Let's jump into the 101 here, Amir. So, how can I achieve my games dreams, Amir Safa?
So, gosh, I mean, we could talk like 10 hours about just this one topic, but let's get the conversation started. How about that? I think what I just said segues nicely into this topic, which is everything in life, in my opinion, is about trade-offs, right? Every person needs to ask themselves at every moment, what am I willing to trade off and what am I not? And that's going to be different from others. As I mentioned, for me, not good or bad or in between, that was my trade off decision. I was not willing to move to the West Coast. I have a fairly high degree of confidence that I've been willing to move to Irvine, LA, whatever. I could have been in the game industry 15, 20 years perhaps by now, but I didn't want to do that. For some people, people have student loans. For some people, people have other family members themselves, other family members they need to financially support or help. Everyone's situation needs to be respected, and they need to find what those trade-offs are. So where I'm getting at is, I think step one is, what are you willing to do to get a job in the games industry, knowing that it isn't right or wrong or in between? Are you willing to work at the smallest little developer that's in somewhere very far away from where you live just to get resume experience and be a game designer? Or are you only willing to work at like the 10 biggest names in the industry, or like it's not acceptable to you? What level of a pay cut are you willing to take? Are you willing to move? Are you willing to do contract work? Are you willing to do just like game jams and make products, even if you can't find a full-time job? And so I think step one, as part of those career planning materials we have on amirsat.com, is I literally say to people, forget the CVs and the resumes and everything, sit down with a white paper and ask yourself those bigger questions first. As you know, for the Games Jobs workbook we now track 3,700 companies. Now, all those companies, of course, do not hire. I think off the top of my head, something like 1,200 or something like that do. But that's 1,200 places that could give you a job. So I think that's step one. Let me pause for a second and let you respond to that, and then I can keep going.
It's a powerful step one. I think you immediately made me think of Napoleon Hill. I'm curious what you think of the classic Think and Grow Rich. It's for many people one of their first sort of self-help or like personal development books. And he has the concept of a burning desire statement, which is essentially a goal but fancy. And one of the ways that it's fancy is the concept of what will you give for the goal. When you write your statement, it needs to include specifically, this is what I'm in some ways sacrificing. I think that's sort of a negative spin on what he's trying to say. But what are you giving up to get this dream? And I think that's one of the first things you're saying here, which is like, look, games is hard. There's like the pragmatic side, which is that games is hard. There's a ton of people trying to get not that many roles. But the other side, the more optimistic side, or the side I like to live in, is the side that like, this is a wonderful industry. It's got its sharp corners. But if you insist on being the very best, eventually you're going to find that way in. Amir was unwilling to relocate anywhere, in the world, stayed exactly where he was, and eventually he found his way in. If you keep pushing, it's pretty hard for people to deny you your entire life.
Yeah, and like, again, I never present these things as universals because they're not universal. But I will say again, for Amir, if I was like, I have job X that's in games and I have job Y that's not in games, if job-wise profile meant that I could be remote, I could be in Connecticut, it had a really good wage and salary profile and so forth, I wouldn't automatically take Y because I'm not primarily driven by money. But if you started filling in the blanks of what that job was, if it was something good, I'd probably consider it, even if it wasn't in game. So like, I think I also, as many regulars in the channel and on social media who follow me and follow you have seen, I state these stats for what I call Project Flagpole, which is the output of all the data our community collects that's proprietary. And based on that, which people don't talk about enough, I have what I believe are reasonably reliable stats, which is the chance of getting into games over a 12-month period as a new applicant is about 3 to 4%, which is the same odds as getting into like Juilliard or Harvard. If you lost your jobs in games and you're trying to get reassimilated into games, my statistics suggest that the odds are about 20 to 25%. Now, in really good times, double or triple those numbers. But double or triple it doesn't mean 100%. I firmly believe, based upon the data I have for 3-4 years, that even in the best of times, about 1 in 10 people find roles in the industry. And so I think step one is just accepting that that's a fact. So many of the conversations that I have with folks who come to me are like, they start with, you were like, don't put I am in front of things. My thing is like, stop saying, what am I doing wrong? Hey, Amir, what am I doing wrong? Amir, what's wrong with my resume? Amir, what's wrong with me? Amir, what's wrong with my qualifications? And I'm like, there's nothing wrong with you. You have chosen an industry that is vocational and has a supply and demand profile that means that most people are going to go away unhappy. And so, in a way, you have to be a little bit of a lunatic to want to go after a job with this supply and demand profile that pays much less than comparable technical jobs. And I don't consider it like a badge of honor or something like that to be like, oh, well, games are like nothing. I actually think, again, and others may disagree with me, I actually think it's a little bit short-sighted to ever say X or nothing for anything, no matter what that job is. I think it closes you off to interesting opportunities. I think it closes you off from growth that might take you out and then might bring you back in. So that's kind of like step two, which is if step one is considering the alternatives and asking what you're going to sacrifice, I think step two is then becoming educated about what the other alternatives are and making sure that as much as you're applying to games, you apply to other things. Not only to keep your options open, but in fact, I consider it kind of confirming that if you are aware of all the other options and you keep coming back to you still want to do games, that's good. That means you looked at everything and now you're more informed and you've confirmed that that's what you want to do. So those are the first two steps. I'll pause again for a second and then I can keep going.
Yeah, really fascinating. I think it's something that I've always found fascinating, interesting about you, Amir, and about your approach is you tend to be one of the ways that I relate to you is the optimism. In your soul, at least as far as I know of you, there's a ton of optimism. There's a surplus of optimism. But you also here, speaking right here, you're being incredibly pragmatic. You're being very practical. This is the percent odds, and you got to know it. And it reminds me of a lesson I learned from one of our students a couple of years ago, which I don't think Gwen is in the audience, and I've mentioned Gwen and this exact lesson before. But at some point, Gwen, one of our students, came up to me and said, hey, I'm so grateful for you being really optimistic, but honestly, I just need straight up honest feedback. Please tell me what I'm doing wrong. And I think that's maybe a part of the lesson. Like, I think those two things need to exist. I think you need to have both. You need to be able to remain optimistic. Those people who get something done, whatever X is, whatever the thing is that you're trying to get done, can only get it done if they believe it's possible, if there is belief first. And so even though it's a 3 to 4% chance, even in the best of times, you have to believe like, I can hit that if I keep at it long enough. And I can push myself to get closer every year, every month. But then on the other side, I think there needs to be the understanding, the appreciation for those odds. That means that on average, and we're all in the average. I used to think I was above the average. I'm sure many of you do too. We're all in the average. On average, that means it's going to take you a number of years to break in if you're a total newbie, if you're just getting started.
Yeah, and it's even worse now because given the supply and demand dynamics, and I talked about this in a post the other day, more people who are beyond the true early stage, they're out of work too. So everything is getting pushed up in terms of experience. If the role says 1 to 3, they're hiring people that are 3 to 5 and so forth. So it's really, really tough. I mean, I think the next step after the first two that we've discussed now is now you get into, well, what tangible things am I going to do to make myself a more attractive candidate and to make sure that I'm considering everything that's on the board? Now here, my kind of hot take on this is, I feel like people overfixate on one aspect of their application that I think is the wrong thing to overfixate on, which is People obsess over their portfolio, their CV, and their cover letters. And I think that those matter, and having those clean and having your LinkedIn profile clean matters. But again, I always go back to the data. I'm a very data oriented person. Given our community has now helped over 1,800 people find work, and I also have data on the people who are still looking, I can start tracking, not for every single one of those people, but I have enough data to make some reasonable projections of the statistical weights of different things that matter. The number one thing that is most important in getting a job in games, and you could probably say this about most jobs, but it's particularly true for vocational industries like ours, is connections to other people. This is why, even though it's hard to hear, especially for early career people, especially in an environment like this, and this is why, again, I tell people to be pragmatic about paying their bills, is there is no magic button you're going to turn to build relationships. In fact, something I regularly call out schools and other professionals for as a challenge to them is, but of course, this is a long-term thing that a big topic that needs to be solved is, places need to do a much better job of giving kids who are coming out of college more exposure to professionals in the industry. That's why we have over 2,100 people in our community and coaching network, and why it's entirely free and open to everyone. Because I was tired of asking others to build it, so we just built it ourselves. But that's what's going to really help you. My data shows that you are 10 times plus more likely to get a job if you have a connection, even if the vaguest connection with somebody on the hiring team or the recruiting team. And you can't just write someone and be like, hey, I need a job, I'm stressed out. Even though that's very real and I'm very sympathetic to someone being in that situation, now having had a taste, even though I'm not a recruiter, and being on the other end of that, if you're getting 500 plus notes a day sometimes, and everyone's writing you and being like, here's my resume, can you hold on to this and let me know if you see any opportunities in production? Maybe there's people much smarter out there than me. There are, in fact, many people much, much smarter than me. But I do not have the intellectual capacity to store all of that in my brain. It's impossible. And so the only way you're going to build quality relationships is taking 6 to 12 months, having a ton of conversations, not being transactional, having coffees, having lunches, going to meetups. And this kind of relates to the last piece that I'll say, which is beyond your education, beyond everything else you do, the other two things that I found have the most impact is finding quality things that you can do that you can point to and get your name out there. That could be starting a blog, it could be posting on LinkedIn, it could be developing your portfolio, it could be doing game jams, it could be doing stuff like that, it could be starting like some industry group or something like that. What I always tell people is like, ask yourself, if you were a random person scouring the internet or social media, how would somebody find you if they had no idea that you existed? And if the answer is that they couldn't find you, well, you need to ask yourself, how can I give them a way to find me? And so I think the CVs, the LinkedIn, the cover letters, the here's my degree, here's the things that I studied in school, all of that matters. But now assume that 1,000 other people have that for each job. What else are you going to do to get an edge over the long term to win? And that's what I think you have to do.
Yeah, I love it. It's like it's a very like warrior mindset. It's I'm living in the knowledge of the difficulty of the situation, but I'm pursuing it anyway. I'm going after it anyway. And it's doing what you can do to make those connections. I have found the exact same thing to be true. We've done about 100 of these interviews now, for instance, where we're asking how people got started. And I am not as data-oriented as Amir here, so I can't tell you the exact stat, but it's probably something like 70% to 75% of people got their first job because they knew somebody. They ran into somebody who gave them a chance. That's what we hear time and time again. Cold applications work. They happen. Occasionally you'll get them. But for the vast majority of people, you get your first job because somebody knows you and thinks you seem cool. And they either directly bat for you, they actually pull you in, or they at least give you a referral, and that gets you the job. So
yeah, and again, it's like what's pardon me for jumping in for 2 seconds, Willem, but You're so right. Like people often talk about in this world, right? Positive versus normative things, what we would want to be true versus what is true, right? Something that, again, I have immense empathy for anybody, but particularly new people who want to enter the industry is the dynamics have changed, right? When I came out of college, people were still submitting to many jobs with paper applications. Now, many things in this world have a double-edged sword to it. It opens up access and equity, which is terrific for anyone to apply to a role. But now that anybody can apply to anything, it's much harder to stand out. And I'm sure many of you who either have been in the industry or are older and have read about it, or are younger and just were interested in it, have read all these like incredible stories about how, for people in the Atari era, for people like Todd Howard, for like lots of the big names in the industry, it's like they showed up at like the parking lot of the company, or they just like called the number of the company and someone picked up. Like shit like that happened 30, 40 years ago, but that does not happen anymore. Like, or it happens very rarely. And the rare opportunities that happens organically, which is why I got our channel into the business of trying to give free tickets away to events, is that stuff can happen at events, but it is just much harder to create those organic moments, which is why, again, in lieu of that, I always think like, what's the closest proxy to that? And the closest proxy to that is like catching some senior person's attention with some project or some cause or something you're involved in.
Yeah, it's it's so funny that you say that. I don't know. This is something that I stress now and then. I don't know if people quite understand how young our industry still is. Like most of the past masters who established everything that we follow are still alive and making games right this second. We're still ultimately in the early stages of the game industry, but we definitely aren't in that like creative, very beginning origin of the game industry. But that said, we are still pretty young. And as far as it goes, the way you're going to get a job is you're going to run into somebody who thinks you're cool. There's a prerequisite to being cool, which is being cool and building games and having that portfolio and having an understanding of the tech tools and being able to show that person, whoever they might be, that you're a good person to invest in. But yes, finding a connection is really how you get jobs at this point in time. I'm curious, are there more steps? Are we on the final step there, or are there more? You've given us 3 so far.
I'm thinking if there's anything else. That is basically it. I mean, the only other thing that I'll say is people need to be aggressive in thinking about what a games role or opportunity looks like. I want to kind of come back in a circle to where we started. Like if a classic trap that I see is that people overfixate on like the resume and the CV and the like, what have I done wrong thing, I would say another trap, no matter how many times I say it, no matter if I say it until I'm blue in the face, is I'll have people in our community, God bless them, and I say this with empathy. I say this in zero bit of a mocking way because I understand and I've been there. So I say this with empathy, okay? They will have followed me in our community for like a year. They will have heard all the advice. They will have heard all the tips. And one of those tips that I say over and over and over and over again is stop having the concept of a dream company. Stop being fixated on the same 5 companies that everyone is fixated on and being like, I have to work at Blizzard, EA, Xbox, Nintendo, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because everyone is fixated on those places. They get unrealistic application volumes and they are the most competitive. I say all of this over and over again. And when I talk to people, the first thing they'll say is, I'll be like, so what are you looking at? They're like, Blizzard, EA, Nintendo, and Xbox. I'm like, oh, Jesus Christ. Like, is nobody like listening to anything that I'm saying? So like, my point is, again, there are over 1,000 hiring game studios that we track. Now, not all of those are remote. Not all of those are going to be in places that people are. Not all of those are going to have functions that are a match for what you're looking for, but they're all those companies. There are adjacencies. There are companies like NVIDIA. There are companies like Discord. There are companies like, again, Microsoft and Amazon, where you may not even get a role in games, but you may get a job, and I'm totally making it up, like Office 365. And you're a good employee with high reviews. Do exactly what I did. Do that and then transfer over and make a lateral move. So, I would encourage people to just have a much more expansive view of jobs. And I guess the last thing I'll say is and this is the hardest advice to hear because the counterpoint is people will say, Amir, I have, again, student loans, I have unpaid bills, I need to earn money, to which my usual response is I am totally empathetic. If I was in your shoes, I would be applying to any job, whether it's in games or not. You have to really take that time. There are no shortcuts, especially in an economy like this, and don't let the frustration seep in and manifest itself in you sending out 100 applications a week to every imaginable role in like design and production and everything like that. All these companies have very sophisticated ATS systems for tracking everything. If you write every recruiter at EA and say to them, hey, I'm so and so and I'm looking for roles, people are going to talk. It really sucks. I don't like it. Again, it's a point of industry education and development that I tell others that we shouldn't pick, in a sense, candidates while they're down by having these pretenses of you can't be like overwhelmed and sad and like honestly admit that you're stressed out because of the job process. You shouldn't get dinged for these types of things. But again, positive versus normative, you will get dinged for these things. So it's like, it's hard. It's hard. Like, I hope what he's coming across is not like scolding Amir, being like applicants who are trying to break in, why aren't you doing these things? The tone that I intend is, it sucks. It sucks that this is what you have to do in many cases to break through. But after thinking about this nonstop for 2 years with tens of thousands of applicants, this is the best way to do it. And there are no shortcuts.
Yeah, it's a fascinating problem. I think it's something that a lot of these creative industries face. It's very similar in film, for instance, how hard it is to break into film, and it only really seems to get harder over time. I do think I think like I also I want to spend a second to maybe clarify to the audience. Both myself and I think you, Amir, would agree that optimism and like wonder and beauty and joy are the way to go. Like, try not to dwell in this land of like, damn, this is hard to break into, because you'll get trapped there, and it's really easy to kind of drown in that land, in that feeling. This is a really powerful industry, and I would urge all of you to, I think the main point here is remain flexible in those jobs that you're getting. My first industry job was at Lumosity. We made brain training games. We were popular for a brief explosion in time, but past that, we're mostly forgotten this time by now. And yet it was one of the most wonderful times in my life. I'm not exaggerating. It was a job that I never would have taken if I didn't have help from a connection, in this case, my brother. I didn't even at that point think that games was what I wanted to do with myself. But after working there, my entire life got set on a specific track that I now love. So I think remaining flexible and remaining resilient and enjoying the wonder of this industry.
No, I mean, you nailed it, William. And like, look, again, everybody has different personal values. I say this with zero judgment. It's not good or bad or in between. For some people, their job is an extremely important amount of their part of their life. People who are my best friends, people who are my family members, I have utmost respect for that. As long as you're being honest with yourself about what your life priorities are. You don't have to convince me. You don't have to convince Willem, but you need to be at peace with your priorities. For me, everything else that I do that is not my wife, my kids, my parents, my in-laws, my siblings-in-law, my family, and my best friends, and like the personal things that matter to me in my life, like my personal enjoyment of games, of music, of going outside, of cooking, etc. If all of that stuff that I just said matters like a million, everything else matters like 100. So like, it's important, but like, I would challenge people not to convince you, but that is a valid way of organizing your life. And that if you find richness in those things, you won't have these up and down swings. Now, the complexity of it is everybody has to pay their bills, and that is a much more serious situation. I've been fired. I've been unemployed before. I know what that feels like, literally. But again, that's another reason to not tie up your identity in your job, because then it will make it easier to apply to other jobs, to make sacrifices, and make sure that you put your financial and personal welfare first rather than something else.
I love it. Yeah, it's maybe worth saying, we realized semi-recently that we actually have 3 sort of audiences at the Indie Game Academy. The first 2 are the really obvious ones, people who want to start studios and people who want to break into games, or really career transitioners. But the third category is people who just want to make games. And it doesn't need to be any special. It even is just largely a hobby for those people. It's just about making games. I don't really care where it goes. And that's a really wonderful place to be, because it allows like freedom and openness.
Freedom and open, and being more relaxed, Willem. Right now, I beg your pardon, very quickly. Like, absolutely. Ironically, if you free up your mind and you have a paying job and you're now comfortable, even if your paying job is not in games and you're doing whatever it is, I assure you, having that peace of mind and now having the time to build up those connections, to build up your skills, to do it in a slow way, to not have to worry about that. Ironically, that's going to make you much more likely to find your way into games too.
It's funny. I feel like actually all of capitalism right now is realizing that, like, hey, actually, slower is pretty all right. All right. So I've taken enough of your time, Amir. I want to get some community questions in here. So we've got Rick up on stage for the first one. Good old Rick is a mainstay on our show, asks questions basically every episode, and they're always powerful. So, Rick, would you like to kick us off with some community questions?
Hey, Amir, I've loved all of your advice here about how you really just need to keep charging forward and doing it. Like, act as if you're in the industry, whether or not you actually are. That's like the best way to get in. Very, very powerful advice. So I have a question for obviously right now the industry has a lot more people looking for work than jobs available. So the opportunities are inherently more limited. So for people who aren't waiting to get the opportunity and they're determined to just make their own opportunities, what do you feel is like the best advice, the wisdom for that path? Like, what's the best size of a studio that they could make? We got a lot of people here in the Indie Game Academy with a lot of connections to be able to form actual studios. So, like, what's your advice to those kinds of people? How many people and the path?
It's a great question, Rick. I mean, I'm going to give the honest answer, which maybe isn't the most satisfying answer, which is now if I actually put my day job hat on of being a BD at Tencent and all the opportunities I see and all the pitches and all the hundreds of games that I look at each year, I think that I would in fact say that the best advice I have is that there is no like blueprint or common size. Like, if I think that the big game changer that Steam has introduced into the community for games is that anybody in any situation can make something that is a standout. Balatro was made by like one person. You have like Lucas Pope. You have like, Stardew Valley. So it's like, I would say the biggest challenge that I see is I often call this in life the like PowerPoint problem. And what I mean by that is people overthink that like the design and the shape and the structure of what they're doing like has to be perfect. Do we have I'm totally again making up numbers. Do we have a 4-person team? What's the deck going to look like? How are we going to sell ourselves? What's our brand name? What's our logo? And what I always say to people is just like everybody relax. Like the only thing that matters is, do you have the time and the stick-to-itiveness to work on making a game? If the answer to that is yes, great. Question number 2, whether you have one person or you have 20, what is the idea that you have that you think is differentiated? And what is the right team size, given the time that you have to spend on it, that is going to get you to the result of building up the game? If you can answer those 2 questions, you've done 95% of the work, and then it's just a matter of getting started and actually doing it. So my advice is don't get bound up in a template and don't overthink getting yourself started. Just figure out those 2 pieces and get going.
Very cool. Thank you.
You bet.
Amazing answer. I'm going to piggyback on that because we run micro-sized indie studios out the wazoo. We run a lot of them. I tend to find that 3 to 5 is the sort of ideal, like I'm just figuring it out. We're building a game together kind of size. But I think Amir's point about being flexible and knowing that there is no size that is perfect is totally correct. All right. I'm going to ask a question for Harry before we have Wendy here go. Harry basically asked, what are some of your pieces of advice on where to go? He mentions IGDA. He doesn't have an IGDA close by. What are some of the places to go to make those networks and connections?
This is a good question. Let me take that as a to-do to post on, because I have gotten, that's a great question, and I've gotten that a few times. So I think about this in kind of like large, medium, small categories. So everyone knows the tentpole things like GDC and Gamescom and so forth. So I'm gonna answer your answer kind of hopefully more comprehensively. For those, my advice is be aware of like what the 5 to 10 major events are overall and like in whatever geo you live. In terms of getting tickets to those, work with my community, work with others. There's a lot of groups, again, whenever I name a name, I'm just naming the first thing that pops into my head. IGDA, Women in Games, so forth and so on. They will have often free tickets, giveaways, raffles. Our community has them. So for the big ones, that's your approach, and I think those are good opportunities. At the other extreme, for those who are more like the small, medium category, like let's say GamesBeat, I will make a post furnishing some suggestions of lists. There are many, many good lists like this, but I have a few that I prefer more than others. And my advice would be find a mix of things that are truly like working group activities. A lot of places have publicly listed things of like game jams or meeting up with other game devs and actual like small format events. And I would also say, I've been spending a lot of time. So watch out for the list. I promise I will post that for everybody in the next week. And if I don't, bug me about it, because I forget sometimes, I apologize. But as much as I say, be a little bit cautious in over contacting hiring managers and recruiters. One thing that I have found for applicants that I think you don't have to be particularly shy about is don't be shy about reaching out to not like the head of the organization, but someone who's involved in event organization for an event that you're interested in, and politely asking them if you can have a comp ticket. Say like you're looking for work, say like you're a student out of like, wherever, or you're like a young professional. I've seen many, many people have success with that. So I'll help you scout out the events, but also don't be afraid to just ask people. Oftentimes you'll get a positive response.
That's awesome. It's so true. Like whenever we hear these stories, like I said, we've done about 100 interviews now. Whenever we hear these stories, it's not usually, well, I talked to the hiring manager and they were like, wow, shoot, you're the perfect person. It's usually like, yeah, I was talking to some random person and they were a graphic designer at this company over there. And then they referred me to this person who works at that company, and that company wound up hiring. And then they had a friend over there. It's this roundabout way. You never really know where those opportunities are going to come from. So go to your events, find those events. There's so many different places that'll host events. And then also just reach out. Cold calling is real. Go say hi to cool people. And when you say hi to cool people, don't hit up the CEO. Don't hit up the hiring manager. You can, but it's just not going to be as effective as just hitting up some cool people who work in games. Look for somebody a year or two ahead of you. That's always what I like to do.
Yeah, and while I will help, you don't need me, what I'm literally going to do when I go to the computer. I mean, I have a few things bookmarked. I'm being a little bit facetious, but literally if you Google comprehensive list games events and you go through the first 20 or 30 responses in Google, you will basically find what I'm going to send you. There's a few sites that are very good. Some of them are really over the top and have 1,000 things. Some only have a small number. So I would say even if you just do that, you'll probably find the equivalent of what I'm going to send you.
Yeah. And there's plenty of online events. I have people talking about oh man, there's no events close to me. There's plenty of online events. And here we are. I've never met Amir in real life. Amir is super cool. And now we're buddies because we're talking online. It happens. All right. Next we have Wendy on stage. Wendy, thank you for being patient. Would you like to ask your question?
Yes. Hi, hey, where is it? Hey, Amir. Good to see you again, Willem. Really quick question. When's the next level 2? I need to get in on this.
The next level 2 is not yet scheduled, but it will probably be towards the end of the year, something like August, October-ish.
Okay. So,
yeah.
Sorry, that wasn't my question, but I'm I gotta ask. Okay, so Amir, good to see you again, and I need to say huge congrats to you and the community for the Discord. Obviously I may be a little biased, but it's so fantastic, and I need to give that quick shout out.
No, I appreciate it. Honestly, I was inspired by by what Willem and the team are doing here, and as I told him personally and reached out to let him know, I think with all of these things, and I hope that again, if anything comes through, if thing number one that comes through is I'm always, like Willem said, like him, encouraging and positive. Thing number two is my attitude is more means better. And it's not about Amir's community. It's not about Willem's community. I don't even think that way. It's our community. And it's all about all of us just trying to have more cracks. So if Willem's community is the first one someone sees, perfect. I would rather they go to his community and not come to mine rather than having no support. So thank you, Wendy. Thank you for all your help. You're just such a good friend to me. And I'm glad that we're just joining this constellation of great places that people can go.
So well said.
We gotta come up with a name for it, by the way, the constellation. Sorry to interrupt, Wendy.
No, I totally agree. So my really quick question, and I took a lot of time, but whatever you can give me on this or give us. So the communities or the people, the audiences rather, that Willem mentions, People who really wanted to get into games, or hey, I just want to make games and it just doesn't matter how I do it. What advice would you have for people to, I don't know, just do something? Like, what is it? Game jams? Is it go to events? Is it all the above? What kind of things would you recommend people search out for just to be doing something and kind of keep the ball, keep the ball rolling, I guess?
No, for sure, Wendy. I mean, like, look, there are always going to be exceptions, right? As we know, you can go to any event, and no matter what Amir says or what William says, some people will be assholes and some people will be really great. But my experience is 95% plus, 99% plus of gamers are very inclusive, very welcoming. And so my serious advice, having gone to a number of these things myself, is kind of a paired advice to my point of not overthinking getting a game project started. I would say don't overthink going to games events. Just find stuff in your area that seems like a reasonable fit, even if it's a stretch fit of what you're doing, whether it's a jam, whether it's some type of game inclusion group, whether it's some type of industry event, whether it's a company that's having a recruiting event. And I would just say, just start showing up at stuff. Even if you feel completely fish out of water and you're like, what the heck am I doing here? Like, all these people are like serious game designers. I don't know how to program. I always tell people, screw it. Just go there and just be there. And I bet you will find that 95, 99 times out of 100, people will be like, wow, Wendy, it's so good to see you here. Like, let's tell you about this thing we're working on. And you will, in fact, probably find people like you who have different skills. Like, one thing I have a lot of empathy about is I really don't like talking about myself because I'm not that type of person. And so I never talk about my credentials or things like that, except if I'm making a very, very specific point. And I'm now going to make a very specific point, which is, you would think someone who's worked in like a solid banking program, has multiple degrees, has worked at like Amazon, has done whatever, you'd be like, oh, Amir, you must not have like a problem. You just walk into like a game event or you walk into like a job interview and people are like, oh yeah, let's grab this guy. I assure you that is not the experience that I've had in my career. And in fact, as someone who is not like game designer, artist, programmer, production in like the big four, I have often felt in that outside position of like, well, is everyone just going to think I'm like this guy who has no real skills because I'm like a BD person? But when I got over that fear and I just started going to stuff, I realized that people pull you in. And then after doing that just a few times, that fear will melt away.
Awesome. That is actually pretty powerful, with the advice that you've given. I would say I got into this late myself, and your story also is very motivating to me as well, just to say keep going. So thank you so much.
No, of course.
Thank you, Wendy. I love that as an answer. It's very simple. There's a lot. There's many ways into the industry, and I think like we're giving you advice, and you'll hear advice in so many places. But the idea of breaking down that first step and making it as small and simple as possible is a really good one. Don't think you have to do anything in particular. Just start. Really, just start. We're pretty much at the end of the episode. I want to make sure that we have time for our last question, which is Kat. So here's how we're going to do it. I'm going to throw the question of the day out here, which is something we do in this podcast to reiterate one of the most important learnings from the episode. So the first person to type the correct answer to this question in the comments will get 3 House Cup points for the coveted Indie Game Academy House Cup. And then once I ask the question, y'all can type in the chat. I'm going to have Kat ask their question. And then once Kat finishes their question, we'll announce who won. So here's their question. Amir gave us 3 steps to achieve your game dev dreams. What are those 3 steps? Write it in the chat. First person to get it right. If you're listening, speak it out loud. All right, Kat, would you like to ask the final community question? While people
for sure. Also, thanks so much for hosting this. Hi, Amir. It's so nice to finally talk to you in person rather than on the LinkedIn.
It's really nice, Kat. Yeah.
I'd love to ask you about creating content on LinkedIn. I know the algorithm is a mess, but how do you kind of continuously create posts that are interesting? And it's so crucial for job hunters to create content of your own, to interact with other people, and to network. I have been creating my own content for a while, and some of it takes off, some of it doesn't, and even the posts that I feel really, really good about just don't. So I'm just curious about your experience with that.
Absolutely. Let me first assure you, I'd like to say I have a magic formula and I know which content for myself will take off. I do not know. I am often very surprised of what is a complete dud and what isn't. So let me tell you what I do. What I do is I back into first how much content I want to create in a week or create in a month. For a while I was creating more, but as time has been more limited, it's a bit tighter. So let's say for sake of argument, I want to create 60 posts a month. That is a lot of content, but let's say that's what I want to do. What I typically do is I sit down in Excel, and I recommend this to others as well, and I create columns based upon kind of categories of content. So I know some of the stuff that I create will be kind of updates, promotions, events for stuff in the community. Some of the stuff that I do is kind of like life discussing, philosophizing that I do. Some of it is games analysis and so forth and so on. I try to keep a balance so that I have a little bit of each volume of content, and I don't do it so precisely as being like column A, now column B, now column C, but I do that. Then for that monthly grid, I fill in anywhere from, I take like a third off of that number. So if it's 60, I fill in like 40 ideas of what the content will be for the month, and I have all those nuggets ready to go. This allows me, first of all, some room for spontaneity. So when something comes up that's like a news of the day or something that I thought was a cool idea that I hadn't thought of, I can fill it in. But it also gives me the advantage that I rely very heavily on scheduled posts to help get the content out. So somewhere between, given the given month, half to anywhere up to as much as 90% some months of the content I write is pre-written and scheduled to seem spontaneous, but so I can write it in batches on weekends. So those are a few ideas to maybe get your content going again.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kat. That was a great question. Useful for me as well. I'll echo the concept of it's really hard to tell what it'll actually do well. There's times where I'll like pour my soul into a post and it'll get like 20 likes, and then I'll copy some random meme I saw on Reddit and it'll get 3,000 likes. It just is. All right, so the winner of the House Cup question of the day was Taco. The answer to the question, what are Amir's 3 steps, is to achieve your game's dreams, is number 1, what are you willing to give in order to get it? So write down what you're willing to give in order to get those game's dreams. Number 2 is to stay flexible, consider alternate options. And number 3 is what can I do to be more a more attractive candidate? So essentially focusing on your own growth, your own awesomeness. You got to be cool to get somebody to come network and help you out. All right, it's the end of the episode. Amir, what we like to do on this show is to assign a little homework. So what is something that the audience can do in the next week that'll take them about an hour to practice some of what we talked about here today?
Absolutely. I would say for everybody here, take a sheet of paper, draw 2 lines in it so that you have 3 columns. Column number 1 is I want you to identify at least 5 game events over the next 12 months that you're interested in, that you're going to try to go to. Column number 2 is I'd like you to pick 3 things that you're going to do to try to be engaged more with games in a way that could have a publicly displayable component that will show that engagement. Column number 3 is I want to challenge you to go through our Games Jobs workbook and take a look at least 10 more game development companies after searching through a bit that have roles that could be interesting fits for you that you may have never looked at before, just to prove to yourself that there are more jobs out there than you think there are.
Awesome. Do we have a name for this assignment? I'm going to reiterate it so everybody remembers. But do we have like a cute name we can give this? The Dream Matrix?
Let's call it the 3 columns. So as a reminder for everybody, column 1 is games events that you're going to go to. Column 2 is things you're going to do to be more engaged with the industry that you can do, whether it's a game jam, whether it's writing, whether it's your portfolio, and many others. And column 3 is just diversifying your scope and awareness of the range of games jobs out there. It is true that the percentages are small, but again, everything is about increasing scope. If having connections is a big multiplier, another big multiplier is just being fully aware of that field of 1,000 plus versus just having that vision of the top 5 to 10 places.
I love it. Awesome. All right. So the 3-column assignment is to create 3 columns. Number 1, 5 game events you're gonna go to. Number 2, 3 things that you can do to be publicly engaged in the game industry. The last one is to go through the jobs workbook and find 10 jobs at companies you haven't heard of before or you're less familiar about that you may enjoy working for. The way that we do the homework is either post that to LinkedIn for us if you are brave and confident, get yourself a little public presence, tag the Indie Game Academy, perhaps tag Amir as well. And if that's a little too uncomfortable for you, you can come into the Discord and post it in the Discord for feedback as well. All right, it is the end of the episode. Amir, do you have any last thoughts or any plugs you want to put here before we say goodbye?
Please look at amirsatvat.com, join our Discord, and go on our LinkedIn. I always appreciate follows. And as a last little giveaway, since a few people have pinged me about LinkedIn content, I'll tell you a little secret. Likes are vastly overrated. The most important thing for the algorithm is comments. So anything that you can do to get people commenting on your post has like a 10 to 20 times weight versus likes. So don't stress yourself about likes. Ask people what their opinion is on stuff instead.
That's awesome. Fantastic advice. I'm writing it down for myself. It has been such a pleasure, Amir. I've been looking forward to this ever since we first agreed to it, and it really delivered. I've had a wonderful time. I feel like you've really given us some wonderful insights. Thank you for giving this to our community and your own community. It has been a fantastic episode. As always, we host this every Wednesday at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. There are links to join the Discord down below. We will include all of the links mentioned in the episode as well down below, so go and join Discord, Amir's community as well. And go to amirsatvat.com, check out the Joms workbook, all that good, amazing stuff. We'll also include a link to Amir's LinkedIn. He is somebody to follow if there is anybody to follow. That's going to do it. We'll be back here 12 p.m. Eastern Time next week, Wednesday. And Amir, thank you for being here. Thank you for answering your questions. It's fantastic.
Thank you so much. And enjoy the artwork at amirsatvat.com from Taco Duchess / Desiree. She's a marvel. Willem, you're a great friend, and have a good day, everybody. Thank you.
Have a good day, everybody. Thank you, and take care.